Thank you, Mudassir. Thank you, Kuma. Thanks very much for your kind invitation. I'm more than happy to speak. I will probably speak about 25 minutes, I guess. And then it was already announced that we will have a very robust Q&A session. So I'm looking forward for your robust questions, and I try to give you some answers. So the following, I will have 8 points to make. First, I give you a brief background. Secondly, we try to look at some maps. Let's see, Mudassir, if that works out. Third,
yeah,
I will
trying to open it if possible. I'll be sharing it.
Good. Thirdly, I will briefly highlight some different legal views on annexation. Basically, how does Israel view the West Bank, and how does the rest of the world more or less view the international standing, the international legal standing of the West Bank. Fourthly, I will speak about why did the annexation debate come up right now, and why did it come up 10 years ago or something. Fifth, I will look at international reactions and potential consequences. Point 7, I will briefly touch on discussions within Israel. And point 8, conclusions, I will ask and give some hints maybe, why haven't we seen an annexation so far? So let's get started. What's the very, very concrete background, the very brief background? Well, it is the current Israeli governing coalition has decided, or has signed a coalition agreement between the main parties, between the Likud and Blue and White, that it will enable a vote on annexing parts of the West Bank starting from July 1st. It didn't put it more concretely either which parts of the West Bank, nor when exactly, just starts from July 1st. Neither was it written that everyone in the coalition has to agree to that, just that it would enable a vote on July 1st. Now the date has passed and we haven't seen a vote in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Nevertheless, as you know, it caused a major stir in the international world, or maybe at least from a European perspective in the international world. I don't know how it is seen from India. So it caused some stir, certainly in Europe and in the Arab world. It's important to mention that this decision, or this announcement to annex parts of the West Bank, is quite a turnaround for Benjamin Netanyahu. Because while the majority of his party, the Likud, has long supported annexation or annexation of the West Bank or parts of the West Bank, Netanyahu was a long-time opponent of such a move, hinting towards the negative consequences this might have. Yet he changed his mind during an election campaign in 2019. We were seeing 3 election campaigns in Israel for a variety of reasons. That makes also clear, and I will come back to that in a later point, the annexation debate is somehow linked to the election campaign. We'll see that. Now, secondly, what does annexation mean? And if it's possible, I would look at some maps now, Mudassir. Would that be a possibility?
I've tried to upload it. Is it visible? No.
No, I think you need to share your screen.
Yeah, I'm trying, but you know,
it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So,
try it again.
I should have announced that in advance. I'm sorry.
Is it coming?
Can it change into as the host?
Him.
Maybe that's a possibility. If
yeah,
you
try that, yes.
Yeah, can you put him as a host? That would be easier.
In the meantime, we just I just talk about the next point instead and come back to the maps maybe later. someone has, I think someone has his mic
Somebody
on.
is talking. That's that's another disturbance. Somebody's talking.
I've muted all of them.
I think it's Mr. Shishin Elliott. Yeah, thank you. So in the meantime, let me jump to different views, different legal views on the annexation of the West Bank or parts of the West Bank. First of all, the Israeli government does not speak about annexation, but sipuach in Hebrew, but they speak about the sovereignty, ribunut. Why so? Because unlike most of the world, Israel doesn't view the West Bank, or as they call it, Judea and Samaria, Yehuda v'Shomron, as occupied territory. Rather, they refer to it as disputed territory, because the argument is that the West Bank was never a sovereign entity, never sovereign independent entity. Before Israel occupied it, or before Israel controlled it in 1967, it was, in the Israeli view, illegally occupied by Jordan from 1949 to 1967. And thus, they refer back to a different date. So they refer back to the mandate lasting from 1920 to 1947 and 1948. And they say Israel is the legal successor of the British mandate, and therefore Israel does not occupy the West Bank, but Israel it's a disputed territory, and Israel can apply sovereignty there.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. I have changed the host to you. I mean, make you host. So maybe you can try and see if you can share it.
Yes. Okay. So do you see now the map?
Yes, it is visible.
Yes, perfect.
Yes, yes.
So let me just finish the legal issues before I come to the maps. So that's the Israeli point. But the Israeli point, or the Israeli view on the West Bank, that it is not occupied but disputed territory, is, as one scholar has put it, rejected by a near totality of legal experts around the world. The majority of international scholars and bodies sees the West Bank very well as occupied, established by different United Security Council resolutions, most known 242, 338, 2334, and several more. It is established that Israel occupies the West Bank. One must mention that occupation per se is not illegal in international law. The settlements, though, are illegal, but occupation per se, as long as it is temporal, it is not. It's not illegal. Now, one can, of course, ask when becomes temporal, non-temporal, after 50 years, after 100 years, or whatever. But currently, most of the scholars would say it's not illegal, the occupation. But, of course, the settlements are illegal, and annexation will also be illegal, because the majority of scholars is saying that this would be an acquisition of territory by force of the War of 1967. So that's just briefly on the legal issues. So now let me turn to the maps. Just a second. I just let people in since I'm the host. Okay.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, so here we go. This is the current status quo in the West Bank after the Oslo Accords of the 90s. The gray area we see here is Israeli-controlled territory, it's so-called Area C. And the greenish area, the dark green and the lighter green, is an area, are the areas A and B, which are controlled, which are controlled by Palestinians, but to a different extent. In the area B, in the dark green area, Palestinians have also the sole security control, police control. In the area B, there's a cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians. What you see here in blue are the settlements, Israeli settlements, and in red is the so-called separation barrier. We won't speak today about the separation barrier. Just to make it more clear, here, sorry that most of the map is in German, but this map shows quite fine how far spread Israeli settlements and outposts are across the West Bank, so the blue dots. Okay, now, what has been proposed in terms of the peace process so far? One of the core features of the peace process are the so-called land swaps. So that is to say, what kind of borders could a Palestinian state have in the realm or in the context of a peace treaty? And the most advanced discussion could certainly be seen in the Annapolis peace negotiations 2008 and 2009, where we see here the Israeli proposal, where the Israeli proposed that they would keep the blue territories, the settlements which are blue here, Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, and Ariel, Modin Ilit. So those settlements where probably 70% of the Israeli settlers live. And in exchange, the Palestinians should have gotten other parts of Israel proper, which you see here in green. The Palestinians made a different suggestion. They suggested that they suggested that the land swaps should be less. Israel should get some of the settlement blocks. Here you see the blue dots. And in exchange, they would have gotten less of the territory. But the idea is clear. For all the land, or almost the land which will be annexed by Israel in the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, there is an exchange from Israel proper. But it is also clear, if you look at those maps, in those peace negotiations, it would have been certainly not all settlements, as you can see here. So now let's go to the Trump plan, how things have changed here. The Trump plan says, now if you look first here to the orange map, that in the peace agreement, Israel should have been able to annex all the settlements and roughly 30% of the West Bank, what you can see here and also here. And in exchange, the Palestinians should have gotten, well, kind of a bit of a weird territory in the Negev down here. But if you look at the maps, of course, that's quite a chunk Israel would have been able to annex in the Trump plan. And in addition, if you look at these small dots here, these are settlements which would have still been under Israeli control, but really in the heartland of the Palestinian state. So you would have had Israeli military presence in the very midst of the Palestinian state. And this is the very basis, these 30% is the basis of what most people were discussing in terms of annexation. So one last map here. That was a proposal made by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Sorry that it's in Hebrew. But this is the Jordan Valley. So, sorry. This is this area you see here, right next to Jordan. And he proposed to annex the Jordan Valley without Palestinian settlements and villages. So without Jericho here, and without all those small numbers, which are Palestinian villages. So Israel would have annexed a territory, and in this territory were little in or exclaves, depends on the view, which are disconnected to any other Palestinian settlement or Palestinian life. So that's, let me, can I stop that? Just a second. So that has been basically roughly the ideas in terms of maps, what we were talking about. So for why we didn't see anything is another point I will discuss in a couple of minutes. But let me come to the issue, why did the annexation discussion come up in the last years at all? Let's say, yeah, I would say in the last 5 years, annexation has really become a topic which emerged from the margins of the public discussion to the center. It was always there, or annexation played always a role within a majority of the Israeli right as an idea, but it was rarely seen as a viable policy option. As one of the staunchest defenders of annexation, and one of former Knesset Speaker Yuli Edelstein has remarked at the beginning of 2019, a couple of years ago, everyone who talked about annexation was seen as totally crazy. We turned that topic in the last years into a mainstream topic. Now, how did that come about? I would argue for two reasons mainly, and these two reasons are President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Let's start with Trump. Trump is seen by many in Israel as a very great friend of Israel. He's probably, in terms of the conflict, the US president which has displayed the strongest pro-Israel stance so far. This could be seen by many decisions. For example, the recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights, the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, naming the pro-settler activist David Friedman as the US ambassador, and many more examples. Just a second, I need to put some. Can you actually see me again, or do you still see the PowerPoint presentation? Can you see me?
So we are seeing the PowerPoint presentation as well.
Ah, yeah?
I mean, the screen is basically the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, so let's move back here. Can you see me now?
Your video is visible, but yes, now it's
good. Okay, so all the better. Back here. So, as said, Trump is seen by many as a great supporter of Israel and the Israeli positions, and also an enabler of many positions of the Israeli rights. This was visible very clearly, for example, when Israel passed the so-called law, or the law for when Israel passed the law legalizing even in Israel as illegal considered outposts of the West Bank. After passing of those laws, one of the most right-wing politicians in the Israeli Knesset, Bezalel Smotrich, had a speech in the Knesset, and he explicitly thanked President Trump that he's such a good friend of Israel, because without his support, the passing of that law would not have been conceivable. So, already in that context, Trump had an influence. But after the publication of the so-called deal of the century, annexation was clearly out in the open. As I already said, according to the plan, Israel should get 30% of the West Bank. And there was also a clause in there, and that's the clause Israelis are referring to, that Israel, which indicated that Israel could annex unilaterally parts of the West Bank if the Palestinians would not agree to the plan. That initially prompted Benjamin Netanyahu to say that Israel will annex the territories right away, but apparently that was not exactly what the Americans meant. It seems like they still think, or they still thought, that there should be some sort of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the Trump peace plan should not just be used as a way to maneuver, a way to enable for Israel to annex the territory. So there is still some rejection of the plans by the US. I will come to that also in a minute. Secondly, we need to look at Benjamin Netanyahu. As I said in the beginning, one needs to understand that Netanyahu was a long-standing opponent of annexations, since he feared the negative international and strategic backlash. He always maintained that Israel is already in control of the relevant strategic areas, so there would be no need to annex them formally. This changed with the election campaigns when Netanyahu was in a particular situation. He had an indictment for corruption looming, which apparently made it necessary for him to remain not only prime minister, but to be prime minister with a certain kind of a coalition that would allow him to act against an indictment, for example, by passing a law which would make prime ministers immune against criminal investigations. The fact was that only right-wing politicians were supporting him in this undertaking. The center-left opposition, headed by Benny Gantz, was saying that they would never sit in a coalition with an indicted prime minister. They said it for the longest time. Now they're sitting in a coalition, but that's a different matter. Looking back then, Netanyahu was in a different place. So at the same time, the race between Netanyahu and Gantz was very close. And the right wing urgently needed to mobilize potential right-wing voters. Otherwise, Netanyahu might have been seeing a defeat by Benny Gantz. So the mobilization was key for Netanyahu. And thus he promised, and that's my reading at least, thus he promised to annex the West Bank if he is re-elected, in order to mobilize all the right-wingers which are out there. Because this was really a 100-degree turnaround by Netanyahu. And that's, in my reading, annexation, and that's why, in my reading, annexation and Netanyahu's indictment are certainly linked. Now, of course, we have a different situation, because Benny Gantz and parts of his party agreed to sit in a coalition with Netanyahu after 3 elections without a result, or without a clear result. But yet, while Benny Gantz's stance is not entirely clear on that issue, at least in the coalition agreement, as I said from the outset, he agreed that there would be a vote, could be a vote starting from July 1st. Now, what are the international reactions to the whole debate? What we have seen are condemnations from the Arab states, from the EU, from Russia, from the UN, and from many more states around the world. We have seen warnings that annexations are likely to threaten the stability in the region, that it endangers Israel's security, and even its identity as a Jewish and democratic state. Some speak, though not everyone, but some speak of a looming apartheid regime. It's a term I rarely use, but it comes up more and more in the discussion. And some in the international community demanded actually sanctions. For example, in the EU, there's this discussion where some states say, we don't see the difference between Russia annexing the Crimea and Israel annexing parts of the West Bank. So some of the, especially the northern and the western states, France, Belgium, Sweden, they say, well, if Israel annexes, we should try to go for sanctions. But it's a disputed issue in the EU. In addition to that, one could see an almost unprecedented effort in public diplomacy by EU and Arab leaders and diplomats to convince Israel and its politicians not to annex. For example, there was a couple of days ago a letter by Boris Johnson from the UK. The foreign minister of the United Emirates wrote a letter in a Hebrew letter, also a primer. In an Israeli newspaper, the ambassadors of Italy, Spain, France, and Germany had a piece in it. The German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas visited Israel, Jordan, and he wanted to visit the Palestinian territories as well. But and the Israelis said, if you visit the Palestinian territories, we have to take you into two weeks quarantine because it's not safe there because of Corona. So that was a interesting move by Israel. And only yesterday or 2 days ago, we saw a joint statement by France, Germany, Jordan, and Egypt warning that the annexation could have legal and security consequences. So the aim of these attempts is to dissuade Israel either entirely from annexing the territories, or, and that's really important, or at least to postpone the decision until the US elections, with the hope that Trump will lose to Joe Biden, who opposes annexation clearly. I will wrap up a bit because I'm short in time, so I will just say a couple of words on the potential consequences. In my reading, annexation will really put a de facto end to the two-state solution if Israel annexes really those 30 parts we saw unilaterally. Why is that so? Because, I mean, as you have seen, the remains doesn't sum up to a viable state. This Palestinian state would have no sovereignty, it would have no territorial contiguity, and Israel could control everything this state does. So it's not a viable state. Secondly, some might argue that this might be reversed in the future and there's still room for negotiations. Yeah, that could be true, but still you have to look at the fact that Israel has a couple of years ago passed a law which, according to which territories can only be given up either by a majority of 80 of 120 Knesset members or by a regular majority in the Knesset and a referendum. And that's a thing which is in the current circumstances very, very hard to see. And thirdly, of course, annexation goes grossly violates the principle of negotiated peace. It sends a message to the Palestinians that we don't want to negotiate with you, we aim for victory. And so the gap between the Palestinians and the Israelis become even further. That much for the consequences. Now we can talk about that later. Let me say a couple of words about the discussions in Israel. In Israel, the picture remains still unclear. There have been several major surveys, some of them indicating that there's a solid majority of Israelis against the annexation. Some of them are also indicating that there is a slight majority in favor of the annexation. So the picture is very unclear. What has changed, though, that is many Israelis now believe that the Trump peace plan is indeed a good attempt to reach a two-state solution. And as said, I doubt that. In the political sphere, you could probably say there is still in the Knesset a majority in favor of at least annexing parts of the annexation, even though in the last weeks people start to doubt that a bit more. Especially Gantz seems to be sensitive to the international pressure. He already said that we should put annexation aside and focus on Corona, as you might know that Israel is maybe the first country to see what has been called the second wave of Corona, and it is hit way harder than in the first time. But also Benjamin Netanyahu has become silent in the last days on the issue of annexation. And that is certainly linked to Corona, but also linked to the silence of the US government. They still seem not to be clear if they want to support annexations or not, and if yes, what kind of annexations they want to support. So we, at the moment, we see a silence, or we hear different voices from the US. Concluding, so currently we see a situation where it's still unclear if there will be annexations at all or not. There is still a joint committee between the US and Israel, which convened right after the publication of the Trump plan, but it did not manage so far to deliver a map which would delineate which territories should be annexed or which would not be annexed. In addition, no one seems to know if there is such a map, or the only person which seems to be really into the picture seems to be Benjamin Netanyahu. Neither Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi or Defense Minister Gantz seem to have any idea if there is a map or what kind of map in Israel is currently developed. Thus, it remains Netanyahu alone, who will not act without an explicit UK from the US. Still, it is unclear if Netanyahu will not be damaged if he doesn't follow up at all after he announced annexation. So he is also between a rock and a hard place currently. In the US, in turn, we will have to see how relevant the annexation issue will be for Trump in the context of the election campaign, which will start every second now. It might gain relevance for the evangelicals, who are very ardent Trump and Israel supporters, but it is not clear if it is still as relevant as it used to be, for a variety of reasons. Therefore, we still have to wait for the next weeks to see what will happen. In the meantime, the number of Israelis who don't believe that annexation will ever happen seems to be growing. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm ready for the robust Q&A.